Mr. Mayor, you're now live.
Quorum being present, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Our first item on the agenda is a resolution to close the meeting to the public. The recommendation is that council close the meeting at 4 p.m. to the public on the basis of the following sections of the community charter, section 91A, 91C, and 92B. Could I get a motion, the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Finley, seconded by Councillor Stash. Any discussion? No discussion, all in favor? Opposed?
Mr. Mayor, you are now live.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start today by acknowledging we're gathered here today on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. With the quorum being present, I'd like to resume today's council meeting. The first item on our agenda, the open agenda here, is the approval of the consent agenda. I'll ask council if someone would like to move the recommendation that we approve the consent agenda and the recommendations contained therein, or to pull any of the items for discussion. Councillor Manas moves the recommendation. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Stash. Any discussion on approval of the consent agenda? No discussion. All in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. We now move on to approval of the regular agenda, and there's one change that was mentioned to council in advance of this meeting. We'll be pulling item 10.3, discussing that topic at a future meeting. Could I get a motion to adopt the regular agenda as amended? Moved by Councillor Justice, seconded by Councillor Finley. Any discussion? No discussion. All in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. I'd like to now briefly provide my mayor's report. Councillors Finley, Callio, and I were recently given a tour of Wildwood, 83-acre eco-forest nestled along the shores of Quesnel Lake and the Yellow Point Cedar area. Wildwood was originally established in the 1930s by Merv Wilkinson, who sustainably managed the site for decades using selective logging practices. Today, Wildwood is owned and managed by the Ecoforestry Institute Society, who have continued Merv's legacy. I'd like to thank the Ecoforestry Institute Society's board and staff for providing us with an overview of this successful forest management model and discussing how we might learn from that here at North Cowichan. Earlier this month, I was invited along with CEO Ted Swaby and our manager of bylaw services and business licensing to a meeting with residents at one of the apartment buildings in the area surrounding the overdose prevention site in the Warmland Shelter along York Road and Lewis Street. This part of our municipality, as you all know, is currently facing challenges related to homelessness, mental health, addictions, and street disorder. These residents were mostly seniors, and I was sorry to hear how many of them are now feeling unsafe leaving their homes as they are seeing an increase in property trespass and street disorder in the area immediately surrounding the building. Staff and I committed to bringing the RCMP back to meet with these folks and hear their concerns directly. And listening to these residents describe the issues they're grappling with every day underscored the need for us as a council to consider all options within our jurisdiction as a municipality to tackle these problems while intensifying our advocacy to the senior levels of government to improve public safety and invest in the necessary housing, mental health, and addiction supports. Last week, our CEO Ted Swaby and myself also met with Dr. Shannon Waters, the Island Health Medical Health Officer for the Cowichan Valley region. We were able to discuss the mental health and addiction services currently available in the Cowichan region, where the current gaps exist, and how North Cowichan can work with Island Health to ensure that we have the appropriate resources available for those who need them most. whether that's more frontline workers and public health outreach, increasing the number of detox beds, or opening new recovery and mental health facilities. I look forward to working with Dr. Waters and Island Health over the coming months as we advocate to the province for greater investments in the mental health and addiction supports that are needed in our community. And that concludes my mayor's report. Councillor Manhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to also acknowledge that this week is a National Police Week. I'd like to acknowledge all the police officers of the North Cowichan Duncan Detachment and all the work they do in order to make our streets safe as much as they can given the circumstances they're under. So I just acknowledge the police service and what they do for us.
To present on behalf of the Cowichan Lake Neighborhood Association. Ms. Montgomery, I know you've presented before, but we have a 10-minute rule for presentations, but as much time as is needed afterwards for questions and answers from council.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Oh, do I advance? Is that what is this for me?
IT will put your power presentation up, and then there's a clicker right here for you.
Or you can just go next slide and they'll advance it.
I'll do that. I'll just say. Okay. So, so thank you, Mr. Mayor. Last summer, North Cowichan Council enacted a community-generated official community plan. One of its objectives is to maintain and increase a healthy tree canopy. The Cowichan Lake Neighborhood Association shares this objective and is again requesting a tree bylaw for that purpose. Next slide, please. There are many reasons to encourage the nurture of trees in residential areas. They are a public asset in so many ways. Large trees add refreshment and livability to a neighborhood through visual enhancement by physically cooling the air and living spaces, and by oxygenating and removing toxins, thus making air more breathable. Large, healthy trees provide needed windbreaks. Not only do trees hold the soil, thus preventing erosion, but the roots of our large native trees can reach many meters into the ground, preventing landslides caused by excessive rain, earth tremors, and natural erosion. This stability is especially important to consider in our area where so much housing is not sited on bedrock. Next, please. Many of our surrounding municipalities have tree bylaws. So North Cowichan is in a position to observe what works to increase tree canopy and what doesn't. Usually, tree bylaws require the purchase of cutting permits with fines for non-compliance. But do they work? Do tree cutting permits actually increase canopy cover? Next, please. Portland's tree canopy has shrunk by 823 acres since 2015, mostly in residential areas. This shrinkage began with the adoption of a strengthened tree protection bylaw, according to a city report released last year. There seems to be many such stories of municipalities adopting such measures to be followed by massive felling of trees before they come into effect. We saw this yet again recently in Langford. Instead of being a deterrent, cutting permits may be seen as just another expense. We would like to propose an incentive approach to balance or even replace permits. Perhaps property owners and developers can be given incentives to retain their mature, healthy trees. Seattle's trees are suffering the same fate as in Portland, but in that case, it's being blamed on development, according to the Seattle Times. Calgary's tree canopy declined by over 30% in less than 2 decades, according to Statistics Canada. City staff there believes the drop is due to formerly undeveloped lands being placed within containment boundaries, urban boundaries. Next slide. In the last 20 years, we have been saddened to witness a sizable piece of forest on Mount Suhalem destroyed, with every last vestige of greenery removed, and even the topsoil scraped clean down to the bare gravel. They turned a rainforest into a desert. Nevertheless, we welcome our new neighbors, although we fear they have moved into what's called a heat island. Lack of tree cover in one part of Portland is thought to be responsible for 54 heat-related deaths in that area, according to Portland State University professor Vivek Chandas. He measured temperatures during a heat wave and found a big discrepancy between leafy neighborhoods, which registered about 37 Celsius, and others with more pavement and few trees, which soared as high as 51 Celsius. Next. My own house in Maple Bay was built 40 years ago, and the builder had the good sense to retain 2 old-growth arbutus trees and a big Gary oak, and a large Gary oak. As well, they left several arbutus and Gary oaks and over a dozen healthy, mature Douglas firs and cedars, all on less than an acre of land. If my house were being built now, all that would be gone. Next, although I think, oh yeah, that's my backyard, sorry. It's not our wish to stop development, but we suggest that developers' methods might be encouraged to change. In section 6.3.2.b, the new OCP says, the municipality will strive to prevent preemptive land clearing by updating the subdivision bylaw. The QLNA urges MNC to put this policy statement into bylaw. Many municipalities require a number of saplings to be planted for every tree removed, but this gives no incentive to retain large trees. The saplings are usually small ornamentals that will never perform like the original native trees, if they survive at all. Saplings are a poor substitute for mature trees. Next. North Cowichan has at times spent a lot of taxpayer funds to clean up tree refuse after windstorms. Therefore, we would suggest that North Cowichan contract consulting arborists to inspect and recommend action required, especially in neighborhoods, along roadsides, and along power lines. This could save the municipality much of the cost of cleanup after storms, as well as power outages and damage to houses. Next. Next. Mature native trees should always be retained in riparian and hazardous areas and endangered ecosystems. This is provincial law, but apparently isn't always followed. North Cowichan must therefore ensure enforcement. The enormous volume of wood in mature trees takes up huge quantities of water, so important in areas prone to flooding. In riparian areas, they shade and cool fish eggs and protect them from overheating. The roots of native trees are like giant hands holding the rocks and substrate against landslide in steep areas. Such areas should be restricted from development in order to protect natural features, property, and human safety. Next. North Cowichan has the distinction of being one of the few places to nurture the endangered Gary oak ecosystem. The Gary oak is the only oak native to Western Canada. Sadly, this endangered ecosystem has shrunk to just a sliver of its former self, and in our area has its last stand along a portion of Cowichan Lake. Next. To sum up, the Cowichan Lake Neighborhood Association suggests that a tree bylaw would contain these measures. 1. Property owners would receive incentives to retain tree canopy on their land. Permits may or may not be required to cut any tree if evidence can be found that finds work to increase tree canopy. 2. Developers would be restricted from extreme clearing of land and/or be incentivized to retain tree canopy. 3. North Cowichan would contract consulting arborists to assess unsafe trees in residential areas and along roadways. 4. Provincial laws protecting mature native trees in riparian and hazardous areas, as well as endangered ecosystems, would be strictly enforced. Our extensive tree canopy provides the distinctiveness of the elegant arbutus, the twisted Gary oak, and the evergreen background of fir and cedar. These form our neighborhood's natural and unique identity. Let's encourage developers to be our partners in making livable, breathable, comfortable communities. We are therefore requesting that North Cowichan redefine its relationship to neighborhood trees and enact a tree bylaw that focuses on increasing tree canopy. Last slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Montgomery. I have a question from Councillor Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. Ms. Montgomery, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to council on behalf of the Neighborhood Association on this topic. I was trying to remember how long ago it was when you spoke to us the first time on a tree bylaw. I think it was maybe 3 years.
I think it was 2018.
Before the pandemic.
It was
right?
2018, I believe, and I had started a petition in 2017.
Right.
And I got 500 signatures and came to present that.
I like the way that your ideas and, in fact, all of our ideas are evolving on this topic. And what I really like about the approach that you're proposing now is that it's not based solely in a tree bylaw that will, based in restricting property owners' abilities to manage the trees on their property. I mean, most property owners seem to really love their trees and probably aren't going to cut them down unless it's it's really necessary. And as you point out, there's no correlation between such bylaws and increased canopy covers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but I guess then the approach that you're proposing is based in positive objectives that I think most people can really get behind. So increasing canopy cover, protecting rare ecosystems, adapting to climate change, and preventing preemptive clearing of land. I think those are all things that we've been thinking about as our approach to tree, are thinking about tree protection is sort of evolving. And I know that you, excuse me, participated in the OCP process, and so I know you're familiar with the OCP. So you probably know that our OCP directs us to consider developing an urban forest strategy, which is basically to figure out how to achieve those multiple objectives and goals. And so we will be, I understand, considering that when we get to OCP implementation, which is coming pretty quickly. I actually, before your delegation, had a reread of the OCP, and you've probably done the same thing, but there's quite a lot in there that speaks to what you're proposing. So our OCP has statements on protecting Gary Oak Meadows and Arbutus Groves, preventing preemptive land clearing, as you said, retaining areas of mature tree cover, and the OCP also says that we should develop urban forest canopy cover targets for both existing and future residential and commercial developments. Says we should develop plans to increase canopy cover in deficient areas, and it says that we should develop a plan for adapting our urban forest to climate change by, for example, looking at planting trees which will be adapted to future climate. So I think that's all really important stuff, and I think I'm hoping you'll see council discussion of that issue and movement on it pretty soon.
Thank you. I would love to see that.
So thanks again for coming to talk to us.
Oh, well, thank you, and you're very welcome.
Councillor Callio, then Councillor Staff.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I just have one question, and that is, what kind of incentives are you looking for the municipality to provide to homeowners or business people to save their trees?
Well, I am not that creative a person. Only incentive I can think of would be a tax incentive for a total area of canopy on one's land, right? But there might be other incentives that, you know, more creative minds would have. But clearly the stick is not working to reach that objective. It's having a contrary effect. So my assumption is that it's time to try the carrot and see if that works.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Your Worship. I do have a question for staff, but quickly, thank you, Ms. Montgomery, for the presentation. Would you be able to, the verbal report that you gave, would you be able to provide that, I guess, would that be to our environmental department? Who's working on our biodiversity plan? What, Your Worship?
Yeah, environmental.
Or would that be sent, would it be to Mr.
Alternative, Mr. Swaby, I believe the planning department is also involved in discussions around the, would be involved in any discussions around tree protection.
So the question is, can we provide this presentation to staff?
It isn't so much the presentation. We, council, we just got the PowerPoint portion of it, but the actual what you were reading, I'd like to see that makes it to staff if possible.
Well, the challenge is that council needs to provide direction, if that's your intent. So, because it's going to be a debate about what you want to achieve out of what's presented, that you would want staff to look at.
So then I guess then I'll follow up with what my question was going to be then. Thank you for that, Mr. Swaby, was where, with the work we're doing on our biodiversity policy that's coming forth, would the tree protection bylaw and then all the great targets set out by the OCP that Councillor Justice mentioned, would those fit in there, such as, you know, urban forests and more of the, looking at the bioclimatic Douglas fir, the Gary oak, and then the tree policy, would that fall, could those all be caught underneath the biodiversity, or what are the actual targets of our biodiversity work? Because of council, we haven't had the preliminary report back to council yet, because we're still in a data collection phase.
Yeah, my sense is there's some overlap, but they would be separate projects if we did look at tree protection measures or urban forest strategy, but I'll turn over to staff to elaborate.
The mayor's correct, absolutely overlap. In fact, you may see recommendations out of biodiversity that directly relate to the issues that we're hearing today. So I think there's definitely a knitting of those issues together.
So we'll get a better idea once we get our first report from staff on that, and then from there we can, in parallel, start forming new policies in the works that will catch any gaps that aren't filled then.
Absolutely, because there was a lot of other issues that both Councillor Justice noted that the OCP talks about and in the presentation that would be outside the biodiversity like you're talking about in the gaps.
Okay, I'm definitely in support of the policy. Of all places, back in Saskatchewan flatland where I was, we actually in our small farming community had a tree protection bylaw in place. And such things were that where if you took a tree down, you actually had to replant another tree on your property. You couldn't just remove a tree. So if you were removing it to build a garage, you had to, and took out 3 trees, you had to replant 3 trees on your property. So, of course, trees were a precious commodity in the prairies. So, but I look at our tree protection policy from a personal experience in Chemainus, whereas there's a current development happening around the Hermit Trail. And while we've got a developer, they're doing great work, there might have been some stuff there with some requirements to provide more setback and protection of the trail, because eventually that's coming in to be a legacy area for the municipality when it turns over to be parks. But what we're seeing now, because of the clearing of the trees too close, now we're having wind-thrown trees within the area that's going to be the park, and we're losing large Douglas firs now because they no longer have a protecting canopy. So I just look at things outside of that, not so much just the river protection and riparian areas and the ongoing watershed issues we're having. So I look forward to our biodiversity plan and when we can actually put this into greater work. So it's something I'll be eagerly supporting, hopefully, that we can do in the future. Thanks.
Councillor Manhouse, and I'd like to offer my own comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to speak because I thought Councillor Justice Istash was going to put forward a motion, and we usually don't do motions on the fly, so I was just going to speak to if he was going to put a motion forward, which I'm glad he did not.
Just to clarify, yeah, Your Worship, it wasn't a motion. I just wanted to make sure that report got to staff to be included in, if it's relevant to the biodiversity, just because we're still in a data collection point. Yep.
So where should I send it?
Send it to council. Send it to all of us, and we'll figure out what to do with it from there.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, just a couple comments for myself, Ms. Montgomery. I appreciated the analysis you've provided on some of the existing tree protection bylaws, not obviously introduced with good intentions, but not necessarily being effective over the long term in terms of increasing that tree canopy coverage. I did a bit of research myself looking at other municipalities in BC, and one model that I started looking into closely was City of Mission. So they obviously have a lot in common with North Cowichan. We've got the 2 oldest community forests in BC, but they started looking at more of a traditional tree bylaw in recent years. And basically what happened was because they still have a lot of rural properties and rural property owners who may want to take a tree down here or there, but are not necessarily supportive of some of the big land clearing you see with some of the larger scale development. They went down a different path. So what City Mission's doing, I had a call with the Mayor Mission last month, is they've got a bylaw they're introducing this spring on regulating land clearing for some of the large scale developments like we would have seen with Cliffs over Maple Bay, which you referenced in your presentation. So that's one approach they're taking to it. And then the other aspect of it is providing incentives for property owners to plant more trees, which again you touched on in your presentation. So it looks like Mission's introducing a fairly new model here. There's quite a bit of information online, but something I'm certainly looking at closely. We've been in contact with their mayor, and he's got their staff sending us over some information, and yeah, happy to share that with you if you're interested in taking a look as well.
Mm-hmm. Very positive.
Councillor Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one more thing through to Councillor Ishtash, but I think the delegation would also be very interested in know. I saw David Preekshot, our environmental specialist, was presenting to the Cowichan Stewardship Roundtable yesterday on the biodiversity project, and he mentioned that one of the products that they'll be coming up with in the policy are some canopy cover targets. So that's going to come out of the biodiversity project for sure.
Well, you can't have biodiversity without trees.
Sure.
Obviously.
Great. Well, thank you, Ms. Montgomery, and I anticipate we're going to be having further discussions about this topic over the coming months.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to public input on agenda items, and I'm going to ask IT staff to just briefly walk through the process for any folks participating virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There are 3 ways to join the speakers list. If on the desktop or web, just click the raise hand button. If on a mobile app, press the 3 dots button and then raise hand. If calling in by telephone, dial the number of the enter the meeting number that is displayed either on the agenda or on the WebEx screen on the live stream. Press *3 to raise or lower your hand, and we'll let you know when you're unmuted. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll start with the in-person attendees who have signed up for public input. First, we have Rob Priestley. Mr. Priestley, if you could come up to the lectern and state your name and your residential address. Mr. Priestley, we allow up to 3 minutes for public input as well.
My name is Rob Priestley of 2861 River Road in Chemainus, Mayor and Council. Good evening. I'm here this evening to speak in support of Agenda Item 13.1, Ecological Impacts of Trails, introduced by Councillor Justice at the May 3rd regular council meeting. First, let me begin by saying that as a hiker, I do use and appreciate the trail network in the municipal forest. I am well aware of the popularity of our extensive trail network with user groups of various kinds. However, I am also aware that the municipal forest contains many sensitive ecosystem environments which support endangered species and actively promote biodiversity. In my opinion, these sensitive ecosystems are of vital importance to protect, and they are not appropriate locations for trails or other forms of development. Human users can put a significant amount of pressure on delicate, sensitive ecosystem environments such as wildflower meadows, wetlands, and areas that support endangered species. Biodiversity is not something that can be sustained without allowing sufficient undisturbed habitat for the diverse range of species that our region supports. Proper stewardship of the land involves extending care and protection to the places that need it the most. Mayor and Council, please support the motion in Agenda Item 13.1 and let us continue to show that we are leaders in taking action to protect sensitive ecosystem environments and to promote biodiversity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. The next speaker on the public input sheet, Joseph Enslow. Mr. Enslow, if you could come up to the lectern and state your residential address.
Thank you. So yes, Joseph Enslow. I live on Lane Road, and I'm here on behalf of COAP, which is coap.ca, which is a citizen-led initiative in North Cowichan. So I'm speaking today on item 10.4. It's the gender-neutral language and pronouns policy. I have a few concerns which are mirrored by many residents throughout North Cowichan. Topics such as racism, sexism, discrimination, these are big words. And throughout the last few years, we've heard a lot from varied groups claiming that they are standing up for what they call systemic racism. You've probably heard that from time to time. Now you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with language and pronouns? And honestly, I'm wondering the same thing. The changes proposed in 10.4 aren't actually even in relation to gender-neutral language or pronouns. It's actually changing terms related to Indigenous peoples, visible minorities, and racialized groups. It's part of the Council Advisory Body Policy. Now that's important, as I'll refer to it later. The topic of concern is systemic racism, not individual discrimination. I'm talking about systemic racism. Racism that exists within institutions and organizations. As an example of the North Cowichan Council Advisory Body Policy, you can find it on northcowichan.ca. In fact, I would encourage you to visit the North Cowichan website, click on I Want To in the upper right-hand corner, and select Volunteer. So these are citizens who wish to give their time, services, or expertise back to their community. I'm going to read you a quote directly from that page. Council will aspire to give precedence to Indigenous people, people from an equity-seeking group, or visible minority, when appointing members to an advisory body. provided the council meets the expertise required or has demonstrated knowledge. The council advisory body policy will provide more information. So let's read that again. Council will aspire to give precedence to. So let's check Merriam-Webster dictionary and see, what does that mean? What does give precedence to? Well, it means priority of importance. It means more important than. So directly on the North Cowichan website, we are promoting systemic racism. In plain English, we are informing the public that the council will make Indigenous people, equity-seeking people, and visible minorities more important than those who don't identify with one of those groups. I urge council to not fight fire with fire. Promoting discrimination to combat discrimination is not a good solution. Attempting to boost one group over another to somehow level the playing field is openly giving an advantage or a disadvantage to someone based solely on how they look or present themselves. Please work with the council advisory body to ensure we treat our citizens with dignity and respect. No one should be made to feel that their race, gender, or identity is somehow a disadvantage or an advantage. North Cowichan can do better. And honestly, I'm ashamed to find a real-world example of systemic racism on our very own website, embedded in our own policies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Ms. Richards as the next speaker. If you could state your name and residential address.
Hello, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm Adriana. I'm speaking on behalf of COPE and its members who asked us to speak against policies and agendas that they don't align with. When I ran for council, I was very ignorant to the fact that council's time would be so taken up focusing on things like words, like what should natural gas be called, or should we change visible minority to racialized? I honestly thought there'd be more work around potholes and road signage. To me, this is not a council matter. If the current thing says that we must change visible minority to racialized, I'm sure that it can be done quietly, as both are inherently racist in wording anyway, so I see no reason to debate this, but then again, here we are. Your website already uses racialized in its wording. We encourage applicants of all ages, abilities, gender identities, racialized identities, ethnicities, etc. Now, while you say this on one hand, you also state council will aspire to give precedence to Indigenous people, from an equity-seeking group, or a visible minority now to be changed, when appointing members to an advisory body. Now, the whole basis for this policy update states it's because in some communities, the people you're referring to are not the minority, so therefore you need to change the wording. Your policy update states to change visible minority to racialized group who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. To simplify this policy, one could remove Caucasian, as that's not a race, and then just place anyone that is non-white presenting in color will be given precedence, i.e. preference. Many ethnicities are white in color. We are literally normalizing the exclusion of a person based on the color of their skin. I thought we worked hard to end that a long time ago. I know I did. Two wrongs don't make a right. How is lumping someone in one group of people into a preferred group based on a pigment of their skin not the epitome of racism? I will add a caveat to your policy that if someone presents as white but shares their sexuality with you, they then would be possibly added to the precedence group. Or what happens if someone is white presenting but in an equity-seeking group? What are the levels of precedence here in North Cowichan? Is there a scale that we can see? It seems a lot messier than just seeing each unique human for their qualities and attributes that they may bring to the table. Let me give you a personal example. I went to apply for a committee here of which I have extensive experience in the field and would have made me an asset to this team. Lo and behold, I read non-Caucasian and non-white in the preference. I told my kids about it that night. Imagine trying to explain it and justify that policy to your kids. My assumption is that it is socially acceptable to use racist wording against one color these days, and without knowing someone's heritage, lineage, upbringing, etc., they would automatically be put at the bottom of a pile, possibly below someone with less experience in the field based on the pigment of their skin. Didn't a great man once say, "I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character"? Not only are we against the change, we're against the wording as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Bernie Jones to the lectern. Mr. Jones, if you could state your name and address.
Bernie Jones, 3307 Cook Street in Chemainus. Briefly, there are 27 municipalities on Vancouver Island. Of those 27, 26 have a tree protection bylaw of some sort. Guess which municipality is the 27th with no such bylaw? Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker from the sign-up sheet here, Emily Yeager. If you'd like to come up to the lectern and state your address.
Hello, my name's Emily Yeager. I am the line producer on agenda number 10.1 for the television motion picture. I just want to introduce myself and my colleagues Rob and Aaron, and we're here to answer any questions for you. And we're very excited for the opportunity to film in your community.
Great, thank you. And I don't see any virtual attendees with their hands raised, but I'll turn to IT staff to double check.
Mr. Mayor, I don't see any attendees in at all.
All right, thank you. We can now move on through the agenda to, there are no bylaws today, so we can move on to reports. And the first report, item 10.1, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Swaby.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.1 is a temporary use application for 1444 Maple Bay Road. And the purpose is to consider a request for a temporary use of this property for motion picture and television filming. Staff's recommendation is that council issue the temporary use permit numbered 27 to Emily Yeager of Kale Media, Inc. to allow motion picture and television filming at 1444 Maple Bay Road on August 15th, 16th, 18th, 21st, 23rd, 24th, 28th, 29th, and 31st, and September 1st, 2023.
Councillor Justice, are you moving it or do you have a question?
I'll move the motion.
It's moved, seconder. Moved by Councillor Manhouse. Any discussion? No discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. We now move on to item 10.2. Back to you, Mr. Swaby.
Item 10.2 is a request for a special public hearing, Mr. Mayor, on June 7th, 2023. Recommendation is that council schedule this public hearing on June 7th, 2023 at 7 p.m. for zoning amendment bylaw 39082023 and zoning amendment section 53 exemption bylaw number 39092023.
Someone like to move the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Finley, seconded by Councillor Callio. Any discussion? No discussion, all in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. Item 10.3 has been removed from the agenda, so we now move on to item 10.4. Back to you, Mr. Swaby.
Mr. Mayor, this is an issue of the use of gender-neutral language and pronouns policy. And the purpose is to consider the use of the gender-neutral language and pronouns policy to promote gender equity by communicating in a gender-neutral way. Staff's recommendation from the report is 1, approve the use of gender-neutral language and pronouns policy as presented. 2, amend the council advisory body policy by A, striking out, quote, other than Indigenous peoples, quote, from the definition of, quote, visible minorities. B, striking out, quote, visible minority, quote, for the term defined in section 3 and replacing it with racialized group. And C, striking out visible minority in section 5.12 and replacing it with racialized group.
Thank you, Mr. Swaby. Would somebody like to move the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Stash, seconded by Councillor Justice. Any discussion? Councillor Justice?
I want to speak just briefly to the gender-neutral language tip sheet and guidance. In general, I'm in favor of using language that promotes equity and leads to everyone feeling welcome. This is especially important for conducting municipal business, both as a service organization and as a workplace. We've now understand that he or she is not inclusive of people whose genders are neither male or female, and it does not cover the full range of persons. Increasingly, the pronoun they has become common in both informal and formal communication to refer to an abstract person. somebody whose gender is not known. So we also know that people can feel excluded by gendered language, and linguists have long recognized that language not only reflects the way we think, it also shapes our thinking. So the proposal for gender-neutral language seems, for the most part, to be reasonable change in the sense of keeping up with evolving social norms. But I do have a couple of questions that I would like to pose to staff. Mr. Mayor, I think probably the first one is that I know that the policy seems only to apply to writing. The policy says gender-neutral language must be used by all members of council, employees, volunteers, and agents of the municipality when drafting correspondence or a document on behalf of the municipality of North Cowichan. So is it intended that this policy not apply to spoken communication? Ms. Martineau?
The policy was drafted in the way that the resolution from council directed staff to draft the policy, and the direction from council was to draft a policy based on written communication. So that's why the policy has taken that focus.
Okay, so that's fine. And it's just writing. Okay, one of the interesting things from my perspective is the formality of communication, of verbal communication in the council chambers. When we tend to use honorifics and titles. In fact, it's almost ritualistic that we use them. And so the question arises in my mind was what should we be doing with respect to addressing somebody who steps up to the lectern whose honorific or title has not been made obvious to us. And so one of the suggestions I was going to make is that the sign-up form for public input and the sign-up for delegations have some spot for an ability for people to indicate both pronouns and also the honorific or title that they like to be addressed by. I think I'll leave it at that, Mr. Mayor.
All right, I've got Councillor Callio, then Councillor Manhas.
I'd just like to say that, you know, it's inclusivity is extremely important, and in this era, we need to be more aware of gender neutral language and pronouns, and especially in our written, you know, statements, emails back and forth to each other. But I do have a couple of concerns with what was written in our paper that was handed out to us, and that is one of the lines in it is, you know, the discussion portion, and I'll read it out, is the use of gender neutral language and pronouns policy. Attachment 1 is intended to promote gender equality by compelling members of council staff and volunteer committees. And I just find it, and I think that the word compelling is too strong a word to use. It's, I just find it that it's, well, just a little too strong. And then also on the actual portion of the council policy on bullets 1 and 2 of 3.3, we have, and I'll read it out, have you used man or men or words containing them to refer to people who may not be men? Or number 2, have you used he, him, his, or himself to refer to people who may not be men? And I just think that maybe one of them could also, like number 2, could, instead of saying he, him, his, or himself, it could say hers, hers, or herself as an amendment to it. Thank you.
Councillor Kai, I missed that last part. Just your last sentence there.
Maybe we could add that as an amendment to change it so it says, have you used her, hers, herself to refer to people who may not be men or maybe women.
Oh, so you've got one, like, more
Yeah, one
masculine
of each,
example?
so it's more gender neutral.
Do we need an amendment for that, or can we?
Yeah, I think the way that you would do it, because I think I understand what you want to do. So you've got with the motion, and then just add an amendment that would be subject to section 3.32, that council replace he with she, him with her, himself with herself, and men with women.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Shy.
So
Yeah, you want to move it?
you could do that as a formal or as a friendly. So if you get a mover and a seconder, and then that will just, if that, the amendment passes,
I think
then that
Councillor
will be
Stash
tagged on.
moved it, so we take it as a friendly amendment?
I was gonna say, you mentioned he can move it and I'll second.
Okay.
Or if it's easiest as a friendly.
I think it's easiest as a friendly, then we just have
Yeah.
one vote instead of voting on the
Yeah.
amendment and then the main motion.
Yeah, I'm willing to support it as a friendly.
All right, great, thank you, Councillor Cowichan.
Thank you.
Councillor Manhas.
Mr. Mayor, I have, well, what should I call you now? She, he, or he, her, he, her? I'm not sure. What would you be called as?
I think you know, we've been working together for a while.
I know,
so.
well, it's confusing now. It's just more and more confusing as we go forward. As somebody who's lived in the Cowichan Valley all my life, close to 60 years now, and has been, faced racism growing up and even in my adult life here, I think the term racialized group is denigrating to us. We've been, racism against us, then we're called a racialized group. I just think that's very, very denigrating to people that have faced racism all their lives. Also, the mayor of Vancouver is in today's province. The mayor of Vancouver today, former mayor, had said he lost this election to a Chinese individual because systemic racism. Where's that racism coming from? Now you're calling us as racialized. Is a white person saying he lost because of systemic racism? I just don't get this policy. What we're taking away, definition of visible minority and replacing it with a racialized group. I just think that's very, very denigrating to us. I know most it's Anglo-Saxons that actually come up with these words and without consulting with actually the racialized group. I'm not sure where people that came up with this policy or staff, if they actually talked to anybody, other than doing some research online, that the policies came out from other Anglo-Saxons that probably came up with this. I think we need to take this back. I just cannot support this. I think it's more of a denigration to the racialized groups, and I just cannot support this at all. I'm just even surprised this even came forward with this. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Manhas. Any other, Councillor Finlay? Oh, no, sorry, Councillor Stash, then Councillor Finlay. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to state that I'd be supporting the motion as written from the recommendation that's been provided from staff. And mostly it's, we don't want to read too much into documents like this, because at the basis of it is that the policy is about making considerations in the way we think. And those considerations are just being, am I being respectful? And am I making space? And am I providing a safe environment? We don't know those things. So all it's asking us is to make considerations of those that we spend our time with in our work, in our leisure, and who we interact with. And when we say, do policies like this have a place in community? Well, a community is about being in this all together. And a family looks out for one another, and they consider how another person wants to conduct themselves or how they present themselves. So this is just about being respectful and having the consideration of those around us. So I thank staff for just putting this forward. And this is really about us just trying to do our best and create a positive environment. So I thank staff for bringing it forward.
Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I knew where I was going to vote on this when I read it, but listening to two of the speakers talk about systemic racism, and also listening to the only visible minority on this council speak quite clearly about his distrust of the word and dislike, sorry, of the word racialized. And when I read the word racialized, I thought it was quite a divisive word and quite a harsh word, where visible minority is definitely not nearly that harsh. I am definitely going to vote against this motion, following in footsteps with Councillor Manas. Thanks.
Councillor Justice, perhaps to close.
Perhaps. I've got a different question, but I wonder if it's worth turning to staff and asking them about this word racialized and why it's been suggested. My understanding is it's not something that's been invented by our staff. I mean, this is a sort of a trend in language use that's sort of society-wide, but maybe staff can speak to that.
So, yes, in our research, we did find that the term visible minorities is something that's being phased out, and the use of the term racialized persons is recommended by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, as well as the other one was the provincial one, which was the Hub. So the Homeless Hub, which is a provincial organization as well, it was their recommendation that we replace visible minorities with racialized persons or communities. So it is not a term that staff designed, and using these two provincial and federal recommendations is why we brought forward the change.
Thank you. On a different topic, and this is with respect to the use of the gender-neutral title or honorific MX, which I believe is pronounced mix. The tip sheet seems to indicate that it should be used, perhaps this is my misread of it, in all communications, effectively replacing the use of Mr., Mrs., and Ms., i.e. whether the individual's preference is known or not known. So am I interpreting that correctly? Is that what the policy suggesting that we ought to do, is use MX in all cases?
I'm going to defer this question to Barb Floden, as communications is the department that drafted the tip sheet.
Is Ms. Floden available? Oh, Ms. Floden, over to you.
Hi, thank you for that question. That is something that has been suggested in other tip sheets as something to use. We can look into clarifying exactly how and when it should be used.
I didn't quite fully get that.
Barb, is your microphone on, or could you speak closer to your mic and rephrase that?
Can you hear me now?
You cut out for a sec. You want to try one more time?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that's a bit better.
Okay, that was a recommendation that we saw in other tip sheets. It was something that was a recommended honorific term, and we can look into how it is further being used more specifically.
Councillor Justice, that answer your question?
I think it answers my question. So let me just try and clarify, because I think for me, a wholesale replacement of the use of Mr. and Mrs. and Ms. in all communication, and being replaced by mix might be a little bit problematic from the perspective of using a term that's uncomfortable for a lot of people who don't want to have the honorific or title MX used with reference to their name. So I think if that is the intent, then I think that we need to maybe rethink that a little bit.
Perhaps staff could clarify. Right now, we're not actually voting on the tip sheet, though, right? We're voting on changing the council advisory body policy, and if we want to amend the inclusive language tip sheet. We could do that
Yeah.
outside of today's motion.
I think what Councillor Justice is speaking to is actually bullet 3.2, basically the last sentence, and where it says that if a person's name is not addressed as doctor, you can use MX, which is pronounced either mix or mux, as a gender-neutral title of courtesy in your writing. So the intent there is if you don't know what the person's specific pronouns are, so if you know someone recognizes themselves as she, her, then you would use Ms. So it's when you don't. So that's what the intent of that paragraph is. The tip sheet is not an attachment to the policy. So this is more, it's just a tip sheet for how the organization communicates.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So, and it's not, so that's not something that would be obligatory for all members of the municipal community to use that gender-neutral honorific and written communication?
No, I think it's provided as an option
Right,
under
thank you.
3.2.
Okay, I'm clear now.
Councillor Mannas and Councillor Finley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had a few phone calls when the Wall of Fame applications came out, actually, and people were saying, have you seen the application yet? I said, no. Then I got hold of Mr. Pukesh and asked him to email me a copy of the application. And the application said, list if you're Aboriginal, if you're First Indigenous, if you're invisible minority. It had 4 or 5 different things. And a couple of these people didn't even apply. They were well qualified to sit on this committee only because they thought, because they were white people, that they would probably never get picked because the others have preference. So that's racism. That's like in itself. So I just cannot support a policy like this, and we got to change our application process too.
Councillor Finley.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I think Councillor Justice kind of hit a nail on the head for me, which was, you know, there's going to be a lot of people that aren't going to appreciate or understand the MX title. And I guess my question is, how many people in North Cowichan, our residents, actually want a policy like this for council to use? It just seems like it's outside our lane, to be honest, in some ways. And I just, you know, we're here to represent our residents, and there's 32,000 residents, and out of the 32,000 residents, I'd be very surprised if there's more than 10 or 15% that might be 100% on board with a policy like this. I think we've had questions about some of the wording in this policy, and I just don't think it's something that we should approve tonight. Thank you.
All right, we've debated this for a while now. We ready for the question? Yeah? All right, so we have a motion on the floor. It's got a friendly amendment attached to it. I'm going to call the question now. All those in favor? And opposed? Councillors Finley and Manhas opposed. The motion carries. We now move on to new business. We have one item under new business, 13.1, ecological impacts of trails. I'll ask you, Councillor Justice, this was your notice of motion, to read out the motion, and assuming there's a seconder, you'll have the first opportunity to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the recommendation is that council directs staff to supplement the biodiversity protection policy project to 1, assess through literature review and consultation with experts in other jurisdictions the potential risks and impact of various types of trails and trail use, including but not limited to hiking, downhill and cross-country mountain biking, equestrian and off-leash dog walking, on wildlife, soils, ecology, vegetation, and water. 2, develop general criteria and guidance for recreation and trail planning and management in our forest areas. 3, identified where trails and specific recreational uses either are or are not appropriate given ecological sensitivities. And 4, identify needed mitigations to existing trails if and where necessary. So, Mr. Mayor, I would make that motion and would speak to it briefly if it gets seconded.
Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Stash. Over to you, Councillor Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't go over the argument that I laid out in the background report in the agenda in full detail. As we all know, our forest trails are becoming increasingly popular for a variety of uses, and this is by design. Our parks policy directs us to increase outdoor recreation opportunities for both the benefit of residents and as an economic development opportunity through tourism. But at the same time, we recognize the need to protect the natural places in our community. We are increasingly aware of the need to protect all life forms out there and their habitats. And the residents of North Cowichan are increasingly oriented to conservation, protecting ecological services and the biological diversity of our area. So this situation is evolving, and thus far we have not really considered how these issues affect each other. So the motion asks staff, as part of the biodiversity protection work, to review what is known about the impacts of trails and trail use on our natural places and the life that inhabits them, so we can make informed and evidence-based decisions about recreation and trail planning and management, and have guidance about where trails and specific recreational uses should or should not occur. So ultimately the goal is for the municipality to have the tools to locate and sanction trails where and in such a way that they provide full community benefit and a great recreational experience while having a minimized negative impact on ecosystem integrity, wildlife, and other ecological services provided by healthy forests.
Thank you, Councillor Justice. I've got a couple speakers, but I'd first just like to ask a question to staff. I'm going to direct it to our General Manager of Corporate Services, Ms. Haldera. I understand there would be costs attached to expanding the scope of the biodiversity protection policy, and wanted to ask if we have funding available in the current budget to accommodate that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Because of some other grant funding that we've received throughout the year, we are able to juggle some other funding around to be able to accommodate this within the current budget.
Great, thank you. I'll turn now to Councillor Estache, then Councillor Callio.
Mr. Mayor,
yes, just Wavy.
I think it's probably important to note, and I know we have Dr. Preekshot here, we have asked the question of the consultant, and he can provide council with how much this will cost and sort of an overview of what we think we can achieve, if that's helpful for the debate.
Sure, that'd be great. Councillor Estache, do you want Dr. Preekshot to weigh in first, or would you like to speak first?
I'll wait.
All right, Dr. Preekshot, then Councillor Estache, Callio, and Finlay.
Thank you very much, Worship. Good evening, Council.
Dr. Preekshot, we're having a bit of trouble hearing you. Is there any way to turn up the volume there?
How does this sound?
It's a little better. If you can talk even louder than that, would be great.
Okay.
That's better.
Thank you, Worship. The estimated increase to the budget would be about $30,000. We would also be looking at increasing the total amount of time that is being devoted to the work. So the first phase, the assessment phase, will have to probably be pushed back for project delivery by something like 4 to 6 months in order to take on the new work. The consultant assures us that they can do this work, but we will likely take on some extra tasks in terms of extending some of the consultation we've done with the public, going to staff, because as most of you are aware, a good portion of these paths are in the municipal forest reserve. So we do already have an operationalized trail management policy, and one which we are going to have to liaise with staff on in order to figure out how we mesh what we are doing with what recommendations may come out of the analysis that is promoted in the motion. So a lot of the work, a lot of the analysis work will piggyback into the assessment that we're already doing of our tree canopy coverage and forests and ecosystems in these areas. But it will involve a certain degree of liaison with staff, and perhaps some re-engagement with the community, and a different flavor to the engagement we're doing with First Nations. I should point out as well that we actually will also be meeting with staff from another municipality on the island, Cumberland, to look at some of the management practices they're engaging with as well. So it is a live conversation, but we can certainly dig deeper into it if that's the will of council. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Peakshot. Over to you, Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will be supporting the motion, but not the expenditure, knowing that there's a cost to it. The reason I bring it up is through the recommendations, I absolutely support with all intent on item 3 is that is the one hole in everything we've done is we actually haven't identified areas that pose significant risk in further ecological sensitivity. Most notably areas of like camas meadows with camas bulbs, as we're seeing native areas of camas dwindling, and areas through Gary Oak, definitely the exposed moss-covered bluffs, areas like that. We really haven't identified within the Parks and Trails Master Plan what areas are very sensitive and important, and I think those need to be brought into consideration. But knowing the impacts, what impacts there are of trails, that information is prolific out there already, and I would make the assumption of saying that our staff are well aware of those and have had those. And I only say that from my work with the previous Parks and Forestry Manager, Don Stewart, working closely with him when we were on the Cowichan Trail Stewardship Society. In 2014 we walked with, and as well with Daryl Frank at that time, the forester, walked our one trail when we built it, and there was areas of wildflowers rerouted around, sensitive bluffs. And then most recently, the only other trail that's been built since 2013 is the Phloem Trail in Maple Mountain, and the first trail being the Xylem Trail. In that trail, we walked with the forester, with the Parks Department, and with a biologist. And we rerouted and moved the trail and going through sensitive areas. And that was with the partnership with North Cowichan and the Cowichan Trail Stewards, knowing that the expertise with our staff is extensive. And most notably now with our forester, Sean Mason, knowing the whole area mapped out. We've kind of loosely known where areas are, such as riparian and wildflowers. But between our staff and our forestry department and the experts within the Cowichan Trail Stewards, I think we can accomplish a lot of these goals right away. And really looking at those areas, I'm not supportive. I'd rather look at the expertise we have here and definitely identify those areas. And then the mitigation work is actually evident already. We've shown best practices, and actually UROC, as Dr. Peakshot mentioned, UROC came to, which is the group that manages the trail systems in there with the community of Cumberland, actually came and had their retreat in Cowichan Bay and brought the Cowichan Trail Stewards as the guest speakers to ask how they've done such a good job in the region. And of course, part of that was in reference with the partnership with North Cowichan. And that comes in from the 40-page report that Cowichan Trail Stewards did on Mount Zuhalem, showing what happens when you don't look after an area for 20 to 30 years. And the work that's been done now has been doing trail reroutes, such as creating a new trail bypassing the ecological reserve, putting barriers in on the cross trail, which kept people away from the sensitive moss areas, moving any trail that went through a drainage system into raised with cedar bridges so that no one's impacting the course of water. So that's going on long for what I'm saying there is that I think within our department, and even in the, Dr. Peakshot mentioned it there, for looking at new trails, there is actually a very extensive criteria where you have to list all the tree species, any red listed issues on animals or vegetation that are at risk, and what impacts there might be. So that extent to it is, I think we're doing a good job already, but definitely I completely support you on knowing that we have to look out some areas, and of course, most notably, it made it in the news, was there, and it leads to why I support sanctioning trails so strongly, was a wildflower meadow that had a rogue trail built through it, which was outside of the mandate of any local user groups or our Parks and Trails Department or our Forestry Department. So identifying those areas of high risk is absolutely important, and why I'll be supporting the motion. I just, now knowing that there was a cost involved, I thought this would be captured within the existing work we're doing. So just at this time this year, I just don't know if we have the budget to do that.
Yeah, but just to be clear, Councillor, we do have funds in the budget, so we secured a provincial
Okay.
grant which freed up funds that have been committed to other work.
So we do, okay, I misunderstood, I thought from other stuff, because of course we had those other meetings today.
Yeah, basically, we'd set aside funding for developing, and sorry to interject, just provide a
Oh,
bit
no,
of clarity.
thank you for the clarity, I
Just
appreciate it.
really quickly, we'd set aside funding for the developing the forest management plan, but through that provincial grant we secured for $500,000, we're able to allocate that towards developing the forest management plan, which frees up other funds in the budget. So if council did decide to pursue this, we do have the available funding without having to amend the 2023 budget.
Well, then that's welcome to hear that we have the funding that can make that work, because what Councillor Justice has provided, I think, is much needed, and it really will add to the work that's been done. I just wouldn't want to disregard the good work that staff has done to this place, and building on the legacy of the good work that Don Stewart did. So I'll be supporting the motion, but I wanted to touch on the good work that's been done since 2013.
Thank you, Councillor Stash. Over to you, Councillor Callio.
Well, there's been some pretty good points made here. Christopher Justice swayed me one way, and then Chris has given me some more other ideas. I spent a lot of time in the mountains up there, and Mount Zuhalem has a plethora of trails, and they're deactivating them, as we speak. And the Cowichan Trail Stewardship Society is doing an excellent job of maintaining the trails and creating the ones that are sanctioned and looking after that. And it's always been a concern of mine while I've been out actually hiking, is that, where does the wildlife go to bed down at night? Where, how are the animals affected by the trail use? I mean, if you go over Mount Zuhalem, and I've been over the whole mountain, it is just full of trails everywhere. Most of them are unsanctioned. And, thank goodness that's ending, and we're getting into a new era of trail building and maintenance. Dr. Preekshot had, a really good point there. I mean, if we're already doing this, is it worthwhile to actually, I agree with your motion, Councillor Justice, completely. But I mean, if we're already doing this, I'm sort of confused now, Rob. You're saying we have the money, but it sounds to me like Dr. Preekshot was saying is that it's going to delay work that's going on if we push this forward to the environmental committee to do. Would that be true, or?
Yeah, Councillor, I'll turn to Dr. Preekshot to clarify, but my understanding is by adopting this motion, we're expanding the scope of the biodiversity protection policy. So by expanding the scope, we're adding additional work to the consultant who's undertaking the work, and which in turn will add about, I think Dr. Preekshot said, about 4 to 6 months of the project. Dr. Preekshot, over to you to clarify. Did I capture that accurately?
Yeah, thank you, Worship. I think you're correct. I know you're correct in the way you summarized that. And just to Councillor Callio's point, I was just wanted to emphasize that there was an operational concern in addressing these questions. So wasn't necessarily meant to characterize that as being a structure in place to completely deal with some of the questions, but just to point out that there was an immediate staffing consideration to take into account to deal with the work that is underway and mesh that with a policy that already exists for management of those lands when we do the analysis.
A follow-up, Councillor Callio.
Thank you, Dr. Preekshot. That clarifies it for me, and thank you for that. So I will be voting for this motion because I really do think that, when I go out in the forest and seeing all these trails that are being created, that, it's just, the Cowichan Trail Stewardship Society, when they build a trail, as Councillor Istash said, you know, they look after the water courses, and drainage is not a problem. They always make sure that drainage is done properly. So I'll be voting for this. Thank you.
Councillor Kelly, Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Your Worship. Real quick on the building of the trails, just to clarify, Cowichan Trail Stewardship Society has only built 2 trails in the last 10 years, and those are being Xylem and Floam. Everything else that exists is rogue-built trails or pre-existing trails. My question for not delay was for follow-up from what I heard then. Can this not be captured underneath the forest management plan and through those funds rather than delaying the biodiversity plan and taxing staff at this point? Can this be captured? And we're still doing the exact same thing, but can we capture it actually, being that it's in the municipal community forest, and this is relevant to policies and uses and protections within the forest? Can this be put into our forest engagement that we're doing right now and captured under that budget, even if we do have the room for it? Rather than, I just don't want to see the biodiversity delayed, and then, you know, if we keep adding, and then, you know, I asked, can tree canopy protection be added in there? I'd hate to keep adding things in there that are going to delay biodiversity protection. So even going back to Councillor Justice, I don't know if that was something that you thought about, because clearly you created this for an intent. Did you think that maybe you could have had this? I know we're not at the point of making motions that are going to speak to what our forest policy is, because we don't even know, but I think this could be captured under that to not slow down the biodiversity program.
So I'll first turn to, Councillor Justice quickly, then to staff. And I know Councillor Finley's been waiting patiently.
Yeah, no, I would actually like some clarification from Dr. Preekshot on that point, especially whether it seems to me that there's probably a distinction to be made between adding on to the time that it will take and delaying it, you know? So maybe Dr. Preekshot could speak to that. Are we actually delaying the biodiversity project, or are we just adding on to the time that it'll take to complete as a slightly distinct?
Thanks for the question. I must admit that I'm having difficulty distinguishing between the two, but I would say that it definitely will push back our timeline. I can't see how the final delivery of the assessment or the policy recommendation phase of the project can't but be delayed at least a few months. It might be cushioned somewhat at the tail end with policy development, but I can't say for sure, just because we are going to be creating extra work, and it means that for the assessment phase report there will be a delay, and I'm conservatively saying 4 months at best, but 6 months at worst. I'm sorry, I can't provide any greater clarity than that, but that's just I think an honest look at
Mr.
what
Mayor,
we're likely to face.
Mr. Swaby.
I just want to sure, because I think I heard Dr. Preekshot say this, and I think he's correct. On the one hand, with the First Nations, we are working with them on the forest reserve on how we protect, how we co-manage issues like trail development. That's clear, that's on their mind. So we have accepted that the MOU amendments that we'll bring to council will have that kind of language in to deal with this. But I think I heard Dr. Preekshot, and I agree that if we're going to develop policy on this, and they're already commenting on and being engaged on the biodiversity work, this could, if I understood it correctly, could delay it while we seek First Nations input into this. And maybe I'll just turn to Dr. Preekshot, because I think that's what I heard, and that could be part of the unknown on how long this will take. And clearly the biodiversity work needs First Nations involvement as well.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Mr. Swaby is entirely correct in his assessment of my opinion. I do have an anticipation that there will be, and I referred to re-engagement on some of the questions, and because of the way that there are overlapping concerns both within our departments and with First Nations partners on managing some of these lands. Part of my estimation of the added time is due to trying to figure out how those engagements are going to be expanded or tweaked.
I have a question related to that, but again, Councillor Finley's been waiting patiently, so it's over to you, Councillor Finley, then we can come back to me after.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Swaby and Dr. Preekshot kind of touched on this, but my question was going to be, with our review right now of the Municipal Forest Reserve and what to do with that that asset that we have, and if the decision is to begin harvesting in some way in the future, how does this coincide with the biodiversity protection policy? Then also, how does it coincide with Councillor Justice's motion? Are they mutually exclusive? Are they intertwined? How is the harvesting, again, if that happens in some capacity, are these connected? Can they both happen at the same time, or is one gonna interact and infringe on the other, I guess is the question.
I'll start with Mr. Swaby and then
So, Mr. Mayor, the forestry review, which has completed the public engagement portion, and we have technical review by UBC that's proposed scenarios that council will be considering on how possibly the forest reserve issues can be dealt with. The management plan that follows when council makes the choice of scenarios is where the rubber meets the road, and we talk about how we actually manage the forest reserve. And the management plan will be informed very strongly by the biodiversity plan and the work that is being done related to whatever scenarios council chooses for applying to the forest reserve. In addition to that, we will be looking to work with First Nations on the details of a forestry management plan that will also take into account the needs and rights and historical values that First Nation brings to the table. So they absolutely all are intertwined, and there is a new reality now with these types of lands in terms of how we look at them and make decisions about how we use them. And that new reality is the First Nations are a partner, and a very important partner in how we manage these lands. And their values in terms of biodiversity and tree protection go far beyond what we think of, and rightfully so. So we have a lot of work to do to actually get to a point where we can say we're going to be harvesting, or we're going to be doing carbon credits, or we're going to be doing trail development, or any other use of the forest reserve. This is a long-term project now that we acknowledge that the First Nations are really important in this process.
Councillor Justice, I saw your hand moving. What? I mean, if I could just throw an idea out there for council to consider, and perhaps this is totally off base, but if we're concerned about adding this component of ecological impact of trails onto the biodiversity protection policy and extending the timeline 4 to 6 months, is there not a way we could complete the biodiversity protection policy on schedule and then have each ecological impacts of trails study as an addendum to the biodiversity protection policy? Like, is that possible? I mean, recognizing that we might find out all kinds of new information as a result of that study on the impact of the trails, we might need to go back and make some tweaks to the biodiversity protection policy, but it keeps some of it separate and related without having to necessarily delay the project currently underway by 4 to 6 months.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask Dr. Preekshot to respond to that? That would clearly be the preference, and there's probably some reasons why it'll cost more to do it later, but maybe Dr. Preekshot would be able to enlighten us.
Thanks for the question. Specific, I guess, because we have Diamond Head engaged with us right now on this issue, it would be meshing that analysis onto work they're already doing. So I can't say for certain how doing it afterwards, after the delivery of the biodiversity protection policy, may affect budgeting. there's probably a likelihood that it could increase the cost, but maybe it wouldn't at all. I really would have to ask them. And secondly, I would have to also inquire as to what their potential availability might be, because they obviously will have their own work schedule, and this would be something that would be happening outside of their anticipated delivery schedule for the biodiversity policy itself. So that would be something I could follow up on to provide more information. I can't state what the risk is, potential budget. I suspect it could be done for the same amount of money, but I can't promise that for sure.
Councillor Justice, then Councillor Stash.
Thank you. Dr. Preachot, as I understood it, the question that the mayor asked you was slightly different than that. It wasn't necessarily about the budget implications. It was about whether the projects could logically be separated in a way that the biodiversity project could be completed on time. And I guess it's about whether that project needs to be a part of the biodiversity protection work, or whether it could be a more standalone in a sort of a logical way.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that quickly, I mean, one way to look at it could be as a third phase for one project. So if I understand correctly, with the biodiversity protection policy, phase 1 is the assessment and inventory of what we currently have. Phase 2 is coming up with various recommendations for actions for municipality to pursue. One way to look at it is this could be the third phase of the study, as that addendum that flushes out some very specific policies with regards to ecological impacts of trails. So we're coming up with these ideas on the fly.
Mr. Mayor, maybe a way that council can give direction is to direct staff to engage the current consultants in biodiversity to complete the biodiversity work first, and then provide for an assessment based on the motion of council, and we can report back on what that does to the costs associated with from Diamond Head, and we can explore the issues that Dr. Preachot may be thinking about that we need to understand better. But I think if that's council's direction, that'll give us something to work with the consultant very specifically.
I'm going to turn to Councillor Justice as the author of the motion here to make sure that's consistent with his intent, and then going back to you, Councillor Stash.
Mr. Mayor, it does seem to me that there's a lot of unanswered questions and some confusion about some logistical things. So it may be worth looking at it the way Mr. Swaby is suggesting. I'm not really too sure of how that would work in terms of how the motion would need to be changed. Maybe Mr. Swaby has some suggestions on how that could work.
Mr. Swaby?
I would add on, and that staff work with the consultant to ensure that the biodiversity contract currently engaged with is not delayed in order to complete the addendum to the work we're engaging them in. And report back to council on the results of those discussions.
Councillor Justice, you comfortable with that suggested amendment?
Yeah, that seems totally reasonable to me.
All right, do you want to move it?
I will move that.
Seconder? Seconded by Councillor Callio. The amendment, yeah. So we'll. Councillor Stash, you want to speak to the amendment or vote on this first thing? All right. Okay, so let's call the question on the amendment, and it's back to you, Councillor Stash. So on the amendment, to add a fifth point to this recommendation, all those in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. So now we've got the main amendment on.
Yep.
The motion as amended on the floor. So over to you, Councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Stash.
I just wanted to come full circle back again to what I was saying is I think we can accomplish the entire full intent of what Councillor Justice is doing here without spending any money and going outside of our staff. On point number 1, there is extensive, well-documented literature locally, provincially, and nationally on impacts of trails, especially being that we're in BC. We're the premier jurisdiction, one of the premier jurisdictions in North America for hiking and biking trails. The documents are there and the best practices are there. for developing criteria, guidance for recreation and trail planning, we have a really strong Parks and Trails master plan. And on doing that trail planning, again, I'm going to go back to our previous manager, Don Stewart, went to the mountain bike symposium conferences and learned and saw the international standards that being employed on trail building. And I feel that our existing staff would have that ability and probably have that knowledge to implement. And again, going towards speaking to our partnership with the local trail organization, those are fully trained and accredited trail builders, as well as outside experts such as Mark Wood of Holistics Trail Design that has come in and helped do the assessments and work. He's worked here for a fraction of those costs, and he works with BC Parks and communities throughout North America, and he's helped here, and most notably on Mount Provost, Swakis. On identifying where trails and specific uses are not appropriate, we've been managing the forest, if we even just go to our modern plan right now, so with our previous forester and our current forester, we've been managing the forest since 1982, since our previous policy. I would be certain to think that they would know where the ecologically sensitive areas are, even if loosely and vaguely identified, because those are requirements underneath best forest practices on riparian areas, wildfire areas. They need to know the wildlife at risk, water courses, riparian areas, water stewardship. So, and then even at that, at a fraction of the cost, if we did use someone locally, such as say even Madrone that has that data on from the extensive GIS work and LiDAR work they've done. So I think we would know that. And identify needed mitigation to existing trail. There's a policy in place, and that's been being implemented since the work was done in 2015 on Mount Zuhalem, and is now showing its good work on decommissioning, fixing, dealing with issues, dealing with the wildflowers, dealing with the bluffs. So that mitigation, again, I just wanted to emphasize that I support absolutely everything Councillor Justice is saying. I think we can do it in-house. I think we can do it without delaying the biodiversity, and I think we can do it without spending money. Of course, we have our staff time and resources, but those are internalized costs, and even though we found money for $30,000, we don't need to spend it because we have the staff here. We have the extensive forest assets and skill that we've had from the previous managers that probably can get us on the right start. And of course, anything we do in the municipality is organic. We change, we correct, we adapt, and we improve as we go. So once we create a policy, we can shift it and create it and make it better as we go. I wanted to come full circle back on all those points I think we can accomplish.
Councillor Manhas, and then back to Councillor Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to say thank you, Councillor Istash, for how eloquently you spoke of how well we manage our forest. If you would have spoke about this earlier, maybe we never need a forest review. Because we have our professional staff that did such a great job, so thank you very much for that. You're awesome. But Councillor Istash mentioned hiking and biking only, and I think there's equestrian, off-leash dog walking and stuff that we have to look at also. I think so. I totally support this amended motion because I think if it's such so great in-house, again I say our forest should be as normal. We should be harvesting. We should, because our biodiversity is great. Our trails are great. Councillor Istash just said that. So, I think we're spending all this money on a forestry review while we had all this in-house staff and that our forest management was awesome and all that. So I just like to say, I will support the amended motion. But thank you, Mr. Councillor Istash.
Thank you, Councillor Manhas. Councillor Justice, perhaps to close.
Perhaps. Yeah, thank you. And I think Councillor Manhas raises a really good point here. I mean, I think what Councillor Stash is largely saying is like, yeah, we could do this. Our staff has the capability of doing this. And there's and I guess that was the original idea of the motion, was for staff to do this. But, staff have indicated time and time again, and tonight it's been repeated, that in fact there isn't the capacity on staff, which is part of the reason that that's being hired out to the idea would be that it would be hired out to a consultant. I mean, of course, you're right. There's tons of literature out there, which is why the motion suggests a literature review, because somehow or other you got to sort of put that all together. I didn't envision it would be quite as costly a literature review, but we do need to sort of put it all together. And I guess the other point is that, we've got particular sorts of ecosystems and particular sorts of wildlife and particular sorts of situations. And again, you're right. We've got this excellent Trails Master Plan, but it is largely silent on how expanding use can occur, in the with conservation as a sort of a partner. So yeah, I think everything that you say is true, and it's kudos to staff. And maybe staff want to speak to this further, but I think that they've already indicated that there's just no capacity in the Environment Department to get this work done.
Yeah, Councillor Stash.
My comments didn't include the Environment Department. They were the Forestry Department and the Parks Department that had the skill set to that. And we hadn't heard from them this evening.
We've been discussing this for a while. I think our positions are pretty clear. We ready to call the question? Yeah? All right. So on the amended motion, all in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. All right, we now move on to question period. So I'll invite any members of the public who may be attending in person or virtually to step forward to the lectern for any questions to council. Yeah. Mr. Ansel?
All right, let's do the thing. All right, am I on? Cool. Okay, I didn't really prepare a great question, but I want to talk to, I guess, the councillors that earlier voted, I guess, yes to the 10.4 policy, the one about the racialized communities. As just a little precursor, it'll take me 30 seconds here. I have two sons. One of my sons looks just like me, fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. My other son happens to be dark skin, brown eyes, brown hair, and that's because my partner is Haida Indian, which means that my family is a mix, I suppose. I would really like to ask council, in your review of the 10.4 policies and the homelessness hub that states that systemic racism often contributes to homelessness, drops out employment issues, and this discrimination is why these issues lead to homelessness. I would just love to understand, for those councillors who voted yes to the 10.4, how is it not racist to say that one of my sons gets the advantages of these things and the other one doesn't?
I think the purpose of the policy is to encourage greater diversity and representation on our committees. And I don't know, most of the folks I hear from the community are pretty supportive of that. Councillor Callio?
Mr. Enslow, I'd just like to say that the part of the policy that I voted on was the gender inclusion part of it. And the racialized part of it, I agree the word sounds kind of harsh to me, and it doesn't speak to me as being inclusive. But the thing is, for me, I was not voting on what you mentioned earlier when you spoke to council, and that was the fact that, you were going over our policies on hiring and stuff like that. To me, what was going on with this policy is all to do with what we do back and forth in council and with each other and back and forth with yourself and us at the table. It wasn't about hiring or firing or any of that kind of stuff. It's all about how we treat each other and how we need to be gender inclusive of everybody. So when it came down to my vote, I was not voting on any kind of anything else that was in our policies. I had nothing to do with any of that stuff. And so for me, it all came down to the fact that this is a fair thing to do. And when I had discussions with, my wife and other people, that my friends, you know, the world's changing, and me being 66 years old, I have to change with it. And there's changes that we don't like, and there's a lot of changes that come around that I don't like, but I just have to kind of change with it. And for me, it was all about the fact that there's an interaction between us on council and with the staff and with the citizens who come in here, like yourself, and speak. You know, I don't want to offend anybody. So for me, I see this policy, I don't necessarily agree with everything there. As I spoke to it earlier, I said that, you know, I put an amendment in about how it was worded, and to me that was important. And the word compelling to myself is too harsh a word. It's almost like you're going to be chastised if you actually say, make a mistake. And people make mistakes, especially me. So that's what it was about for myself. So, I mean, I see what you're saying, but for me, when I had the vote, it was about the inclusivity. Thank you.
Councillor Justice, you wanted to comment? Respond to Mr. Ensel?
Thank you.
Mr. Ensel's question?
Well, you're lucky, Mr. Ensel, because in 4 years I've never seen councillors line up to answer a question at question period. But the motion is a two-part one. The first part was on adopting a gender-neutral communication policy, and the second one was in 3 different places replacing the word visible minority with the word racialized, right? Racialized group. It wasn't about whether either of those words would be used. It was about replacing the old word visible minority with the new word racialized group. I mean, you could, agree or disagree with it, but it was based on, as our corporate officer said, recommendations that came from federal and provincial organizations. So it's, as I understand it, just a change of use in the way that many words sort of go out of vogue because they become offensive after some time to some people or something like that. So I think that's what we voted on, just to sort of modernize the language being used and not make a particular change to any policy.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ensel.
Yeah, Chris, do you have an answer for me?
So you're supposed to go through the mayor on this, like I'm chairing the meeting.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
a protocol
sorry.
thing.
I was just hoping
it's
to
okay,
get
it's just a
everyone's
protocol
feedback,
thing.
if that's
He didn't put
possible.
his hand up, so I didn't want to put him on the spot, but I'll turn
Your
to
worship, I'm fine to respond just because my colleagues, Councillor Caillou and Councillor Justice, spoke fairly to it. My considerations and everything I do are all about making space, showing respect, and not making assumptions on other people to allow them to make the choice and lead the path they want. So as such, for anybody has the opportunity of freedom to come in here and speak and share how they feel, I want to make that space for it and show them the respect they deserve. So this is just about having a lack of worry that you won't have space to be who you want to be or come forward, and that there's always going to be space at the table for you. And such that you're speaking at the pulpit right now, there's always space for you to be there. So when it comes down to it, that's all these documents are about. We can dig into the words and what they mean and Webster's dictionary and everything, but really, it's just about making space, seeing one another, and showing respect and consideration. So that's why I voted the way I did.
Great,
so,
thanks.
And I thank you.
Councillor Stitch, I think we're kind of restating all our positions from the debate, so appreciate the question, Mr. Ensel, but we're just kind of rehashing the debate we just had about an hour ago. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for the question.
I've got a quick question through the mayor to the staff. Can you tell me the names again? I didn't write them down, of where you got this recommendation, the recommendations from, if you wouldn't mind. And if you can't pull them up, then I can just get an email probably from them, as there are some places in the states that also send out these recommendations. And I just was personally so upset to see the one person that's racialized in this group not be heard tonight. So,
Yeah, Ms. Richards, I'll have to correct you on that. Councillor Manhouse was heard. We have debates, we listen to each other, and then we vote a certain way, but it doesn't mean we're not listening to one another and taking that into consideration.
I hear it, but if I was the only woman in the room and I said this makes me feel this way as a woman, I was wondering if you guys had asked the First Nations what they felt of that word as well. But it doesn't seem so. So that's how it made me feel. Anyway, the other thing is I'm wondering if you would think of like a survey or a poll for this MX, because that was a really good point that was made, that possibly there's a lot of people that would be not okay with it. So if you just decided to address me in an email as that, I would not be okay with that. So I'm just wondering if there is a way to balance that so that you are inclusive of everyone, but not presumptive that I want to have an MX in front of my name kind of thing. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll turn to Ms. Martineau with regards to the two organizations that you referenced earlier.
Okay, so the first organization was the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and the other one was the Homeless Hub.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for the questions. I'll turn to the gallery, ask if there are any other members of the public with questions for council. And I don't see any virtual attendees with their hands raised, but I'll check with IT staff just to be sure.
There is not, Mr. Mayor.
All right, that concludes our business, so declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you.